The Ancient City, Book 5, Chapter 3. Christianity Changes the Conditions of Government. The victory of Christianity marks the end of ancient society. With the new religion, this social transformation, which we saw begun 6 or 7 centuries earlier, was completed. To understand how much the principles and the essential rules of politics were then changed, we need only recollect that ancient society had been established by an old religion whose principal dogma was that every god protected exclusively a single family or a single city, and existed only for that. This was the time of the domestic gods and the city-protecting divinities. This religion had produced laws, the relations among men, property, inheritance, legal proceedings. All were regulated not by the principles of natural equity, but by the dogmas of this religion, and with a view to the requirements of its worship. It was this religion that had established a government among men, that of the father in the family, that of the king or magistrate in the city. All had come from religion, that is to say, from the opinion that man had entertained of the divinity. Religion, law, and government were confounded, and had been but a single thing under 3 different aspects. We have sought to place in a clear light this social system of the ancients, where religion was absolute master, both in public and private life, where the state was a religious community, the king a pontiff, the magistrate a priest, and the law a sacred formula, where patriotism was piety, and exile excommunication, where individual liberty was unknown, where man was enslaved to the state through his soul, his body, and his property, where the notions of law and of duty, of justice and of affection were bounded within the limits of the city, where human association was necessarily confined within a certain circumference around a prytaneum, and where men saw no possibility of founding larger societies. Such were the characteristic traits of the Greek and Italian cities during the first period of their history. But little by little, as we have seen, society became modified. Changes took place in government and in laws at the same time as in religious ideas. Already, in the 5th century, which preceded Christianity, the alliance was no longer so close between religion on the one hand and law and politics on the other. The efforts of the oppressed classes, the overthrow of the sacerdotal class, the labors of philosophers, the progress of thought, had unsettled the ancient principles of human association. Men had made incessant efforts to free themselves from the thraldom of this old religion, in which they could no longer believe. Law and politics, as well as morals, in the course of time, were freed from its fetters. But this species of divorce came from the disappearance of the ancient religion. If law and politics began to be a little more independent, it was because men ceased to have religious beliefs. If society was no longer governed by religion, it was especially because this religion no longer had any power. But there came a day when the religious sentiment recovered life and vigor, and when, under the Christian form, belief regained its empire over the soul. Were men not then destined to see the reappearance of the ancient confusion of government and the priesthood, of faith and the law? With Christianity, not only was the religious sentiment revived, but it assumed a higher and less material expression. Whilst previously men had made for themselves gods of the human soul, or of the great forces of nature, they now began to look upon God as really foreign by his essence, from human nature on the one hand, and from the world on the other. The divine being was placed outside and above physical nature. Whilst previously every man had made a god for himself, and there were as many of them as there were families and cities, God now appeared as a unique, immense, universal being, alone animating the worlds, alone able to supply the need of adoration that is in man. Religion, instead of being, as formerly among the nations of Greece and Italy, little more than an assemblage of practices, a series of rites which men repeated without having any idea of them, a succession of formulas which often were no longer understood because the language had grown old, a tradition which had been transmitted from age to age and which owed its sacred character to its antiquity alone, was now a collection of doctrines and a great object proposed to faith. It was no longer exterior. It took up its abode especially in the thoughts of man. It was no longer matter. It became spirit. Christianity changed the nature and the form of adoration. Man no longer offered God food and drink. Prayer was no longer a form of incantation. It was an act of faith and a humble petition. The soul sustained another relation with the divinity. The fear of the gods was replaced by the love of God. Christianity introduced other new ideas. It was not the domestic religion of any family, the national religion of any city or of any race. It belonged neither to a caste nor to a corporation. From its first appearance, it called to itself the whole human race. Christ said to his disciples, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." This principle was so extraordinary and so unexpected that the first disciples hesitated for a moment. We may see in the Acts of the Apostles that several of them refused at first to propagate the new doctrine outside the nation with which it had originated. These disciples thought, like the ancient Jews, that the God of the Jews would not accept adoration from foreigners. Like the Romans and the Greeks of ancient times, they believed that every race had its God, that to propagate the name and worship of this God was to give up one's own good and special protector, and that such a work was contrary at the same time to duty and to interest. But Peter replied to these disciples, "God gave the Gentiles the like gift as he did unto us." St. Paul loved to repeat this grand principle on all occasions, and in every kind of form. God had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. Is he the God of the Jews only? Is he not also of the Gentiles? We are all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles. In all this there was something quite new, for everywhere, in the first ages of humanity, the divinity had been imagined as attaching himself especially to one race. The Jews had believed in the God of the Jews, the Athenians in the Athenian palace, the Romans in Jupiter Capitolinus. The right to practice a worship had been a privilege. The foreigner had been repulsed from the temple. One not a Jew could not enter the temple of the Jews. The Lacedaemonian had not the right to invoke the Athenian palace. It is just to say that in the 5 centuries which preceded Christianity, all who thought were struggling against these narrow rules. Philosophy had often taught, since Anaxagoras, that the God of the universe received the homage of all men, without distinction. The religion of Eleusis had admitted the initiated from all cities. The religion of Cybele, of Serapis, and some others had accepted without distinction worshippers from all nations. The Jews had begun to admit the foreigner to their religion. The Greeks and the Romans had admitted him into their cities. Christianity, coming after all this progress in thought and institutions, presented to the adoration of all men a single God, a universal God, a God who belonged to all, who had no chosen people, and who made no distinction in races, families, or states. For this God there were no longer strangers. The stranger no longer profaned the temple, no longer tainted the sacrifice by his presence. The temple was open to all who believed in God. The priesthood ceased to be hereditary because religion was no longer a patrimony. The worship was no longer kept secret. The rites, the prayers, the dogmas were no longer concealed. On the contrary, there was thenceforth religious instruction, which was not only given, but which was offered. which was carried to those who were farthest away, and which sought out the most indifferent. The spirit of propagandism replaced the law of exclusion. From this, great consequences flowed, as well for the relations between nations as for the government of states. Between nations, religion no longer commanded hatred. It no longer made it the citizen's duty to detest the foreigner. Its very essence, on the contrary, was to teach him that towards the stranger, towards the enemy, he owed duties of justice and even of benevolence. The barriers between nations or races were thus thrown down. The pomerium disappeared. Christ, says the Apostle, hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. But now they are many members, he also says, yet one body. There is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all. The people were also taught that they were all descended from the same common Father. With the unity of God, the unity of the human race also appeared to men's minds, and it was thenceforth a religious necessity to forbid men to hate each other. As to the government of the state, we cannot say that Christianity essentially altered that, precisely because it did not occupy itself with the state. In ancient ages, religion and the state made but one. Every people adored its own god, and every god governed his own people. The same code regulated the relations among men and their duties towards the gods of the city. Religion then governed the state and designated its chiefs by the voice of the lot, or by that of the auspices. The state in its turn interfered with the domain of the conscience and punished every infraction of the rights and the worship of the city. Instead of this, Christ teaches that his kingdom is not of this world. He separates religion from government. Religion, being no longer of the earth, now interferes the least possible in terrestrial affairs. Christ adds, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." It is the first time that God and the state are so clearly distinguished. For Caesar at that period was still the Pontifex Maximus, the chief and the principal organ of the Roman religion. He was the guardian and the interpreter of beliefs. He held the worship and the dogmas in his hands. Even his person was sacred and divine, for it was a peculiarity of the policy of the emperors that, wishing to recover the attributes of ancient royalty, they were careful not to forget the divine character which antiquity had attached to the king pontiffs and to the priest founders. But now Christ breaks the alliance which paganism and the empire wished to renew. He proclaims that religion is no longer the state, and that to obey Caesar is no longer the same thing as to obey God. Christianity completes the overthrow of the local worship. It extinguishes the prytania, and completely destroys the city-protecting divinities. It does more. It refuses to assume the empire which these worships had exercised over civil society. It professes that between the state and itself there is nothing in common. It separates what all antiquity had confounded. We may remark, moreover, that during 3 centuries the new religion lived entirely beyond the action of the state. It knew how to dispense with state protection, and even to struggle against it. These 3 centuries established an abyss between the domain of the government and the domain of religion. And as the recollection of this period could not be effaced, it followed that this distinction became a plain and incontestable truth, which the efforts even of a part of the clergy could not eradicate. This principle was fertile in great results. On one hand, politics became definitively freed from the strict rules which the ancient religion had traced, and could govern men without having to bend to sacred usages, without consulting the auspices or the oracles, without conforming all acts to the beliefs and requirements of a worship. Political action was freer. No other authority than that of the moral law now impeded it. On the other hand, if the state was more completely master in certain things, its action was also more limited. A complete half of man had been freed from its control. Christianity taught that only a part of man belonged to society, that he was bound to it by his body and by his material interests, that when subject to a tyrant, it was his duty to submit, that as a citizen of a republic he ought to give his life for it, but that in what related to his soul he was free, and was bound only to God. Stoicism had already marked this separation. It had restored man to himself, and had founded liberty of conscience. But that which was merely the effort of the energy of a courageous sect, Christianity made a universal and unchangeable rule for succeeding generations. What was only the consolation of a few, it made the common good of humanity. If now we recollect what has been said above on the omnipotence of the states among the ancients, if we bear in mind how far the city, in the name of its sacred character and of religion, which was inherent in it, exercised an absolute empire, we shall see that this new principle was the source whence individual liberty flowed. The mind once freed, the greatest difficulty was overcome, and liberty was compatible with social order. Sentiments and manners, as well as politics, were then changed. The idea which men had of the duties of the citizen were modified. The first duty no longer consisted in giving one's time, one's strength, one's life to the state. Politics and war were no longer the whole of man. All the virtues were no longer comprised in patriotism, for the soul no longer had a country. Man felt that he had other obligations besides that of living and dying for the city. Christianity distinguished the private from the public virtues. By giving less honor to the latter, it elevated the former. It placed God, the family, the human individual above country, the neighbor above the city. Law was also changed in its nature. Among all ancient nations, law had been subject to and had received all its rules from religion. Among the Persians, the Hindus, the Jews, the Greeks, the Italians, and the Gauls, the law had been contained in the sacred books, or in religious traditions, and thus every tradition had made laws after its own image. Christianity is the first religion that did not claim to be the source of law. It occupied itself with the duties of men, not with their interests. Men saw it regulate neither the laws of property, nor the order of succession, nor obligations, nor legal proceedings. It placed itself outside the law, and outside all things purely terrestrial. Law was independent. It could draw its rules from nature, from the human conscience, from the powerful idea of the just that is in men's minds. It could develop in complete liberty, could be reformed and improved without obstacle, could follow the progress of morals, and could conform itself to the interests and social needs of every generation. The happy influence of the new idea is easily seen in the history of Roman law. During several centuries preceding the triumph of Christianity, Roman law had already been striving to disengage itself from religion, and to approach natural equity, but it proceeded only by shifts and devices which enervated and enfeebled its moral authority. The work of regenerating legislation, announced by the Stoic philosophers, pursued by the noble efforts of the Roman jurisconsults, outlined by the artifices and expediences of the praetor, could not completely succeed except by favor of the independence which the new religion allowed to the law. We can see, as Christianity gained ground, that the Roman codes admitted new rules, no longer by subterfuges, but openly and without hesitation. The domestic penates having been overthrown, and the sacred fires extinguished, the ancient constitution of the family disappeared forever, and with it the rules that had flowed from this source. The father had lost the absolute authority which his priesthood had formerly given him, and preserved only that which nature itself had conferred upon him for the good of the child. The wife, whom the old religion placed in a position inferior to the husband, became morally his equal. The laws of property were essentially altered. The sacred landmarks disappeared from the fields. The right of property no longer flowed from religion, but from labor. Its acquisition became easier, and the formalities of the ancient law were definitively abolished. Thus, by the single fact that the family no longer had its domestic religion, its constitution and its laws were transformed. So too, from the single fact that the state no longer had its official religion, the rules for the government of men were forever changed. Our study must end at this limit, which separates ancient from modern polities. We have written the history of a belief. It was established, and human society was constituted. It was modified, and society underwent a series of revolutions. It disappeared, and society changed its character. Such was the law of ancient times.